Okay. So on Tuesday, we talked about qualitative research methods, and I want to be quite clear that what we talked about on Tuesday is basically just scratching the surface with the possibilities of qualitative research. The techniques do basically boil down to either interviews or observations, because that's the two basic ways we have of generating qualitative data. But there are pretty extensive variations of those concepts, particularly when we start getting into things like psychological research, where this is a lot of psychological research has some qualitative components. They may not like to think about it like that, but rather than basing things solely on a survey or completely on official measures of something, a lot of qualitative research is based on a interviewer or an observer's subjective view of a subject's behavior, or the interviewer's impressions of a subject's behavior as they respond to interview questions or complete a task or anything like that. So, I mean, think of the really high profile psychological experiments that you might be familiar with, like the bystander effect. That was a qualitative component. You have a bunch of people who are sitting isolated in a room listening to conversations, contributing when they see fit, and someone goes through a medical emergency. And the researcher in this case would be coding out the subject's responses to that stimuli. So in effect, they're doing qualitative research. And again, this is one of the most profound studies that we have had that it's relevant to the criminal justice system. We now know that if there are more people standing around observing a thing, people are less likely to try to intervene because they assume someone else is going to help. Apologize for the construction. Okay, so when we are looking at qualitative research in general, there are, again, multiple different options that we could look at. And when we don't want to talk to people, we can still observe and describe how people behave. This is not necessarily laboratory based, although if you're looking at more of the psychological side of social science, it definitely can be laboratory based. But social psychology is based a lot in field research. Same with any kind of ethnographic or just straight up observation study in the criminal justice system. Okay. And when we're looking at observations, it is very important to collect a very detailed description of a topic rather than try to explain what's going on. Okay. Reason for that is you don't, as a researcher, you don't want to impart any kind of bias into what you're describing. There may be a time and a place for that, like with Code of the Street, Anderson created a grounded theory approach. He made observations, included very detailed descriptions, and then once he was done collecting everything, he then went through and created this theory. Okay, this theory that individuals are obeying different social mores depending on who they're interacting with and where. So when we're looking at exactly how this process is conducted, the first step is the researcher has to decide if they can participate in a behavior or an environment or how much they can participate, okay? And this is basically a continuum of options. There's always going to be some wiggle room here, but we're going to start at the at one end of the continuum and move all the way to the other. Okay. The thing that is not listed on this slide is one that is probably the least likely to be used and is, in my mind, not very valid. It is the complete participant, and this is where the researcher not only identifies themselves as the researcher, or excuse me, I'm confusing the concepts. A complete observer does not tell the participants that they are observing. They just go and participate in the behavior. An example of this would be the tea room trade. It was by a sociologist who was examining human sexuality and deviance in the 70s. I forget this guy's name. Wikipedia has a really excellent summary of his work and its influence up on its website if you are interested. But the tea room trade was basically this researcher was interested in homosexual behaviors and how individuals participate in that. So he found a role in this by acting as a lookout while men had sex in public restrooms, okay? And this was really important because he didn't tell the people who were going into these restrooms to have sex that he was there as an observer, that he was a researcher at all. He didn't tell anyone about what he was doing. While those men were in those restrooms having sex, he went and collected their license plate data from their vehicles. Okay. And once everything had, once the night was over or whatever, a couple weeks later, he went and looked up those individuals' home addresses and went and interviewed them and asked them about their home life, their family life. I don't want to discount how important and how useful this was, because it basically shined a light on the idea that people were suppressing their sexuality in order to conform with this, in order to conform with society. But the researcher inadvertently exposed all of those individuals, all the people who are participating, to an excessive amount of risk, okay? When the researcher was conducting this research, like conducting the study, homosexuality was full-blown illegal. Like, it was considered a serious misdemeanor, if not a felony, to be caught in any kind of homosexual conduct. So the fact that he had license plate numbers for these individuals meant that if anyone got his information, he would be effectively outing individuals for their sexuality and exposing them not just to criminal risk, but also that was pretty much like extremely easy grounds for a divorce, for losing access to one's children if they had them, to being shunned or disowned by family and friends, losing one's job, employment, or benefits. And in addition to that, you could then be arrested and charged with a felony, because not only has a researcher recorded that you did this thing, it wasn't seen as a, excuse me, I'll just end the thought there because I'm kind of losing it. But that's why I don't really include the complete participant as a mechanism or as a type of field observation, because it has the opportunity to get really unethical really fast, okay? A better option from an ethical standpoint would be the participant as observer. This is where the researcher identifies themselves as a researcher and then still participates in the group. So there is a really cool ethnography that I highly recommend you take a look at. It's called Gang Leader for a Day. Sorry, the author's name slipped my mind again. But in this ethnography, the researcher basically meets up with a gang and talks with them, and throughout their interactions, he basically begins to act as a gang leader, not like encouraging illegal activity, but participating in the social acts and things like that of the gang. And I mean, the book's really fascinating. I don't want to spoil it or anything. But in these instances, it would be much more ethical, okay? Taking a further step back into more of a observer role is the observer as participant. This is where the researcher identifies themselves, explains what they're looking for, but does not participate, okay? This is typically much more common. You could make an argument that this is what Elijah Anderson's work on Code of the Street was, where he said, hey, I'm a sociologist. I'm living in this neighborhood to understand what's going on here. And then interviews people and observes their behavior, observes their body language from a distance. But everyone knows, okay, he's a dude who's got like a jillion degrees and he's just here to talk to me. Like, I know exactly what's going on. I know he's not going to try to buy drugs from me, or he's not going to assault me or anything like that. So it's very objective, okay? Another example of this would be Ruth Horowitz's research on Chicano gangs. I believe she did her research in Chicago, if memory serves, but basically followed the same research line as the researcher behind Gang Leader for a Day, where she went and met with gang members and hung out with them, interviewed them a little bit, observed their interactions, and she did not directly participate in any kind of behavior with them. She was just where they were hanging out, and she was observing their behavior on the street. The last type of, or the other end of the continuum, is the complete observer, okay? This is where someone observes without being a participant. You could think of this as being in a tree stand or a duck blind, okay? You are just out there observing and seeing what's going on. People ideally do not know that you're there, okay? So there is a really interesting development going on in this type of research with the complete observer, in the sense that police officers have body cams that have pretty decent microphones. Surveillance cameras can record an objective view while they are like just out there and they are very visible. Most people continue to act in a certain way and forget that they exist, or a researcher doesn't necessarily have to focus on criminal or deviant behaviors, okay? So qualitative research might get a lot more of a boost in terms of access to data, just because you now have a lot of footage, a lot of information being produced that would allow a researcher a lot easier way of acting as a complete observer than what was done in the Poppin data set, where grad students and undergrads were, in police cars for shifts and observing officer interactions in the field. Everything making sense? So the way that you would choose how to do this is, first and foremost, you have to understand what you're choosing between, okay? Because each of these different options have a trade-off between the researchers' ability to observe the behavior as dispassionately and as ethically as possible, but also participating fully in what the group is doing, either by participating in social roles or experiencing different rituals, is a very valuable perspective. Okay. And researchers have to make this choice. Do I focus on getting as an objective view as possible, or do I fully commit to this type of behavior? Okay. And depending on the type of research or the topic that a researcher is selecting, these subjects themselves can be affected by what the researcher does. This is called reactivity. So I apologize since there are just two of you in the Zoom right now, but can you give me an example of a situation where someone's behavior would be affected by the role that a researcher chooses in the situation? Any ideas? Here's something you might have remembered or seen before, but have you ever been in a classroom with a teacher or with a professor, and there was another professor in the room and they were observing the teacher? Nothing's coming to mind?
Yeah, I've seen that multiple times.
Did the professor who you normally interact with, did they talk differently? They act differently?
Yeah, the people would come in, yeah, they acted like more formal and stuff. Then also the students were like more like less like joking around and like just being more formal too.
Right. And those were probably teaching observations where, as a part of the tenure process and promotion process, professors have to be observed in the classroom because it's a big part of our jobs. So professors, when they're being observed, really want to push the fact that they're on their A game. And students pick up on that. Students are like, well, who the heck is this person? And why are they taking notes about us? I'm not going to mess around because I don't know what's going on. Same basic thing if you just have a random researcher who's interacting with people in the field. Like if you are trying to observe correction officer behavior and you go to their break room and you just chill and say, hey, I'm a researcher at Fort Hays, I'm just sitting here observing your behavior, they're going to act differently, right? So depending on how a research or what a researcher is trying to study, they may have to use different roles. Okay. So something like what Elijah Anderson was doing, where he lived in this community for a significant part of time, or amount of time, he was able to earn people's trust so that he was not seen as kind of an anomaly. With the gang leader for a day, the researcher in question had like long-standing connections with these gang members. He'd worked with them in the field before, they knew him, they trusted him. So he was able to leverage that trust in order to conduct his research, okay? And realistically, if we're looking at something like the tea room trade, that was probably the only way to conduct that type of research at the time. Still, by today's standards, would be seen as radically unethical, but also we did learn a lot from it. It's one of those things where I would say an IRB would never allow that to be done nowadays, but it's not something that we can discount. So when researchers are trying to find people to observe, in many instances, they try to use a snowball or a convenience sampling, okay? So they have identified individuals who have a particular trait that they want to study or are experiencing a particular thing, and they go to that place, okay? So in this instance, going back to the code of the street, Anderson knew the neighborhood had problems that he went and lived in. He was able to look at the census measures and the crime measures and basically able to say, this is probably one of the worst, if not the worst neighborhood in Philadelphia in terms of socioeconomic statuses and criminal behavior. So I'm going to go live there, okay? But by choosing to live there, and it's something he acknowledges quite a bit, is that that neighborhood could be unique. We later find out it's not really unique, but it raises those sampling issues that we can't really address until it's been replicated. Same with something like a convenience sample. So if I were wanting to observe criminal justice students in action, I have criminal justice students here at Fort Hays. So yes, I could go observe their interactions in the field or on tests or whatever, but I can't say that those are consistent or representative of all CJ students until I do more thorough sampling. And to be blunt about it, probability sampling is possible, but it's also very difficult. Like if Anderson was going to live in Philadelphia and do probability sampling, he would need to probably randomly select 20 to 50% of the neighborhoods in Philadelphia and go live there for a significant portion of time. He lived in that one disadvantaged neighborhood for 6 months. And if he were to commit that level of research, like that level of time and attention to each neighborhood, we're looking at probably a decade worth of him just living in different neighborhoods and observing full time. So we're running into something that's very, very difficult to do. We also have to consider the fact that the environment itself, as well as the conditions around the environment that we're looking at, are going to make observations a little bit less objective, okay? Kind of related to the idea of the neighborhood itself. Like Anderson went to the neighborhood, he lived there for a while, but that neighborhood did not exist in a vacuum. Surrounding neighborhoods influenced behavior. People were coming in and out of those neighborhoods, either to visit friends or family, or just as commuters going through it, or moving into or out of the neighborhood. So those kinds of things are very difficult to address when it comes to actually coding the data out or making the observations in the field, but there are also things that we can't discount. So there is a example study your book talks about, in that a researcher got himself hired as a prison guard. Okay. He wanted to study how correction officers used aggressive inmates and aggressive behavior themselves to control behavior within a prison. Okay. That was his research question. So he went to the warden and administration and told them, hey, I'm a researcher. I want to work as a corrections officer and I want to go observe these kinds of behaviors. And they signed off on it. He did not tell his coworkers that he was a researcher. He didn't say, hey, I'm Dr. So-and-so at this university or with this research institute. I'm here working as a corrections officer for the next X number of months or whatever. So this type of method can raise some pretty difficult ethical questions, but also some validity questions. So what might be the ethical issues here? Would you ever consent to have some random professional, like if you're going out in the field, you're a police officer, would you ever consent to someone like me, person who has a PhD in criminal justice, work with you as a police officer? Would that ever be like something you would be cool with?
I feel like it would be fine with me. It would kind of just also depend on what they're trying to find and study as well.
But it would also be one of those situations where, okay, why are you here? What are you looking for? Like, are you judging me? Am I going to show up in some book that's going to try to make you famous? Like,
Yeah, I would worry about like negatives coming out of it, like looking bad or like having like a study that would come out that would just like negatively affect it at all.
right. So, got some pretty significant ethical implications here because the corrections officers and the inmates in this study did not consent to participate in it. Their boss did, the warden. I think the deputy warden did as well. The deputy warden was in on it. But everyone else in the facility, their behavior was effectively observed without their consent. So it's amazing to me this got through IRB. This is a fairly recent study, I believe. And when we're also changing it up a bit, there are some pretty significant validity issues. The facility that allowed him to be a correction officer and also a researcher, or knowing that he's a researcher, is probably not the norm. Most facilities, and indeed most places, are probably not going to be okay with the idea of someone manipulating their hiring process in such a way that they get hired and also can just work as a lower level employee for a while. Like, it seems like that facility knew it had nothing to hide, at least to me. So moving on from this, when we actually go out and collect the type of observational data that we're looking for, we cannot use our memories. Okay, we can't just rely on the fact that we experienced it, therefore we're going to keep an objective memory about something. So we have to record every observation that we make. Okay, this is typically done through a coding sheet. Basically, you have some kind of form that you fill out for every kind of observation to define what you're seeing and quantify what you're seeing. So I'll give you an example. Fall of 2019, Dr. Key and I did a study here at Fort Hays where we had students go to bars. We've talked about this study before in class. And we had them go fill out structured observation sheets about their nights. And then they went and systematically analyzed all the sheets they created and generated a report. And this was basically done so that they could objectively record what they were doing. It started out as a piece of paper that they would turn in, but then it turned into just an email. They copied a form email, had the draft open on their phone, and anytime they wanted to observe something, they just jotted it down. Okay. And this was really easy for them. And they were able to get, pretty decent data about it. And it was very hard to do initially just because we had to develop the questionnaire and we had to help the students understand, okay, this counts as this type of behavior, this does not, okay? It's one of those things where it was really difficult for us to have inter-rater reliability because each student had their own area to work in. But it was something that we figured out. We talked through different scenarios after their first observation period, and we kind of standardized our observations from there. Another benefit to field observations is that we can pretty easily combine them with other data sources. So we can do field observations in addition to any of these other types of data that we've already talked about. So for instance, the Poppin study that had those grad students in police cars observing officer behavior was very easy to incorporate secondary data from things like the police department itself through call for service and crime report data, and also from the Census Bureau. Getting information about these neighborhoods in Indianapolis and St. Petersburg that allowed them to provide context to the different situations. Anderson combined field observations with qualitative interviews so that not only could he observe these behaviors, he could also ask people questions about them. Surveys, same basic thing. And all of these different methods and combinations can provide a much more complete picture of any kind of topic that we're looking at. And this is one of the key strengths of qualitative data in general. We are better able to understand the how and the why of why people behave in certain ways. Both of these, interviews and observations, are fairly flexible and give greater depth of understanding than something like agency data or reports or content analysis or secondary data. And they can help us study things, the concepts that we're interested in their natural settings. We don't have to hand someone a survey so that they can just fill out what they think. We can go observe how they behave. Okay. The issues with this, though, are first and foremost, both interviews and observations have fairly limited generalizability, because if it's a survey, it's very easy to print out a couple thousand of these and just hand them out. But if you're trying to do a bunch of interviews, each interview has to be done carefully and takes a lot of time. And there can be issues with the questions themselves, in the sense that it's a researcher who is asking these questions. So social desirability may play a much stronger role in the individual's responses. People are a lot more comfortable being honest about their motivations and the decisions they make when there's not another person staring at them, examining their body language. Okay. Both of these instances or types of research are expensive and intense, particularly when we're looking at observation data, because rather than being able to just say, I'd like you to come in for this interview, or interviewing someone at their home at a reasonable hour, like we're doing observations in the field, behavior does not stop at business hours. So it can be long nights being in the field, observing people's behavior. It can also be a lot of traveling to observe people's behavior. Think about any kind of like anthropological study where a researcher tried to get in touch with different cultural groups or isolated groups and tried to observe their behavior. Like that's a really intense type of research project. And because of this, because it's so time consuming and intense, most qualitative research is focused on very small areas. Ruth Horowitz and Gang Leader for a Day both focused on single gangs, and not just the entire gang, but just single groups within the gang. Elijah Anderson lived in one neighborhood of Philadelphia. Okay, so in order to generalize this information, you have to take some additional steps, either by incorporating additional data so you can say, hey, this neighborhood experienced these kind of structural factors, had these kind of criminal behaviors. So if we can find other neighborhoods that have those structural factors and also have those criminal results, we can be reasonably sure that the code of the street is prevalent in those neighborhoods. But this may also mean we have to do multiple observations. Okay. The Gang Leader for a Day is effectively a replication of Ruth Horowitz's original work. They added a bunch of things. They added some additional like questions and concerns that the researchers had that we're trying to look for, but it's effectively same basic study. Go observe how a gang behaves. All right. Bottom line with qualitative research, okay, it is very, very rewarding in the sense that you get a lot of very rich and detailed data out of it. But the reason why it's so rare in criminal justice is because it is so expensive, not just in time, but also in resources. And the fact that the criminal justice system is so widely varied, not just across Kansas or the US, but across the world, that there is very limited generalizability in one set of observations. So it's very difficult for researchers to say, I'm going to do a qualitative study, and therefore I'm going to get results that are meaningful for everyone. We can't assume that they are. Which is the reason why the qualitative studies that come out that are seen in the criminal justice field are usually so impactful, and they change the game basically every time. All right. So that ends it for the content for qualitative data and realistically for the class. Next week are your guys' presentations. They will be completely through Zoom. So no one needs to show up for class. However, the people who are presenting will need to have their camera on so we can see you. Just to give you guys kind of a heads up, I don't grade the presentations very difficultly. Like okay, you checked the boxes, you talked about the study that you wanted to do, you explained it, you answered our questions, full credit, okay? I mainly do presentations first and foremost to get people up and talking about their research, mainly because I think it's cool, but also to help curve your paper a little bit. So if you just talk about your paper and it seems like a well thought out idea, even if I point out that there are issues or another of your classmates points out that there are issues, I'm not going to take points off for it. Okay. So I'll go ahead and stop the share real quick.